The smoke hung low, like breath withheld. Pines stood in solemn silence, their tips blackened by the fire that had torn through just days before. The sun, barely rising, filtered through the haze in fractured golds and reds, painting the world in half-light. Too bright to be night, too broken to be day. Somewhere in the charred stillness, a sound broke through. A high, trembling cry. Soft at first, then again, sharper, lonelier. Ash shifted on the forest floor. A small bobcat kitten, barely 10 weeks old, her tawny coat streaked with soot, emerged from beneath a fallen branch. One paw lifted off the ground, trembling. Her ear tufts twitched at every sound, every movement of the wind. She sniffed the air. No scent of her mother, no warm flank to press against. Just smoke, dirt, and the faint metallic tang of heat gone cold. Behind her, the forest bore its wounds. Blackened bark, scorched ferns, a nest burned to ash. Ahead, a narrow road, silent and strange, cut through the ruin like a forgotten promise. Ash limped forward, each step hesitant, each breath shallow. Then, tires on gravel, a soft thud, a truck door opening, a man's voice, low and unsure. "Easy now!" The kitten froze, but didn't run. Instead, she turned, looked up. Her eyes, wild and golden, met his, and in that moment, the forest held its breath again. The morning began like so many others for Eli Morgan. At the edge of Glacier National Park, the ranger's cabin stood stoic beneath a canopy of pine. Summer's end had painted the leaves a dusky gold, but the scent of smoke lingered, a haunting residue from the blaze that swept through the western ridge 3 nights ago. The fire had been contained, but not forgotten. Nothing in the forest ever really was. Eli rose with the sun the way he always did. His back ached, but he didn't mind. At 58, he moved with the quiet weariness of a man who had loved and lost and kept on going. He filled the kettle with water, the handle still warm from yesterday's use, and set it atop the stove. Outside, the wind rustled gently through blackened branches. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, just as he had for the past 7 years. One for himself, one for the other side of the table. It was habit more than hope. His wife, Marin, had passed in early spring. But her mug still sat on the cedarwood counter. Pale green, a chipped rim. Her name etched faintly in script, Marin Lee Morgan. He couldn't bring himself to pack it away. Not yet. Eli carried both mugs to the porch and set hers down on the railing, steam curling into the cool morning air. Then he sat. Silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that sank into the bones, the kind that echoed. Out here, miles from the nearest town, it was easy to believe that time had stopped, that the world had forgotten this corner of Montana, just as it seemed to have forgotten him. The radio crackled inside. He ignored it at first, let it sputter through its usual updates, trail closures, weather warnings, an announcement about an upcoming conservation event at the visitor center. Then came a change in tone. Possible animal activity near the North Line fire zone. Reports of movement near River Bend trailhead. Could be residual wildlife displacement. Proceed with caution. Eli leaned forward. River Bend. That was his zone. He stood slowly, his boots creaking against the wooden floorboards. The sun was higher now, filtering through the smoke like a faded photograph. He grabbed his ranger's jacket from the peg by the door, the fabric worn smooth at the cuffs. He paused, hand resting on the frame. "I'll be back by noon," he said aloud, to no one in particular. Maybe to Marin, maybe to the cabin. The hike out was short, but steep. Past a stretch of charred undergrowth, and the skeletons of what had once been saplings. Every few steps, Eli bent to examine the ground. Broken twigs, faint impressions in the ash, droppings too fresh to belong to deer. Something small had passed through. He reached the bend where the river once braided through the trees, before drought narrowed it to a whisper. That's when he saw them. Tiny prints no bigger than a child's thumb. Paw-shaped, sharp at the toe, fresh. Not a raccoon, not a fox, feline. He followed them with care, the wind carrying faint sounds, a scuffle, a low chirp, almost like a question asked, too softly to be heard. And then he saw her. Nestled beneath the remains of a scorched fern, the bobcat kitten blinked up at him. Her fur was streaked with soot, one paw held just off the ground. She looked too young to be alone. Eli didn't move, didn't speak. She didn't run, she just watched. He crouched slowly, a motion so gentle it felt like a whisper. "Hey now," he murmured, voice softer than the breeze. "Where's your mama?" The kitten tilted her head as if she were wondering the same thing. Something inside Eli shifted. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way stories often claim hearts do. But something loosened. Something that had been wound too tight for too long. In the stillness, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a corner of jerky. The kind he kept for long hikes. He tore off a small piece and laid it in the grass between them. Then he backed away. She didn't move at first, then slowly. She limped forward, nose twitching. She sniffed, looked up at him again, and began to eat. Eli sat back on a stone, the cool seeping into his knees. "I guess you're not the only one out here lost," he said, not expecting an answer. But the kitten stayed, and the wind, for just a moment, carried no smoke at all. By the next morning, the wind had shifted. It carried no fire now, only silence. That eerie kind that follows destruction. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels, no scolding chatter of jays. Just the soft crunch of boots on scorched pine needles as Eli returned to the bend in the trail, the same spot where he'd first seen her. He wasn't sure why he'd come back, maybe because he hadn't seen any other prints nearby, no signs of an adult bobcat, no drag marks, no struggle, just her, alone, limping, eating as if she hadn't in days. He brought cooked chicken this time, just a few pieces torn and wrapped in paper towel, something softer, easier to chew. He'd nearly run out of the jerky anyway. As he approached the bend, he slowed, careful not to snap twigs beneath his boots. Nothing at first, only the blackened trunks, the ashes. Then, movement. She was there again, almost in the same spot, but crouched this time beneath a low, scorched log, watching him, not hiding, not fleeing, just watching. Eli crouched and placed the food gently at the base of a stone. Then he stepped back and sat, pulling his jacket tighter around his frame. The morning was crisp in the shade. She emerged slowly, her body low to the ground. She moved with a cautious limp, placing her injured paw lightly, carefully. But her hunger outweighed her fear. She sniffed the chicken, ears twitching. Then, just like yesterday, she ate. Not fast, not wildly, just like a cat. Eli watched her, his breath soft. "You're not what I expected," he whispered. "But I guess neither am I these days." She paused mid-chew and looked at him, and for the briefest second, he imagined she understood. Not the words, but the grief underneath. That day she followed him, not closely, not openly. But when Eli stood and began the slow walk back to his cabin, he heard the quiet rustle of movement behind him. Paused, heard it pause, moved again, heard it follow. He never turned around, just smiled faintly and said nothing. At the cabin, she didn't come close, just lingered in the tree line, watching, listening, her eyes bright against the burnt backdrop. Eli left a bowl of water near the porch steps, placed another piece of chicken beside it, then went inside. That night, he sat at the table with only one mug of coffee. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the silence pressing so heavy. The next day, she was waiting, sitting at the edge of the clearing like she'd always been there, as if the woods had etched her in place. Eli found himself talking to her more, not babbling, just the quiet, meandering thoughts that never found room with other people. He told her about Maren, about the garden they used to keep, how fire had taken it too. He spoke of his daughter, Cora, who hadn't visited in 2 years since the funeral. He didn't know how to call her. Didn't know what to say that wouldn't reopen wounds. Sometimes he just sat beside the porch steps and let the words go where they wanted. The kitten, he had started calling her Ash, would watch him, sometimes blinking slow, sometimes cleaning her paws with that fierce concentration only young animals have. It took a week for her to climb the first step, another before she curled up beneath the rocking chair and slept there. She limped less now, the swelling in her paw had eased. But the fur around her ears remained singed, and her coat still carried soot in its folds. Eli didn't touch her. He knew better. She wasn't tame and never would be. But she trusted him. Not like a pet, not like a human, like something in between. Then, on a dusky Wednesday evening, she broke the pattern. Eli had left the food on the porch as always and gone inside. But when he returned with his own dinner, peanut butter on toast and a bowl of soup, he found her not beneath the rocking chair, but on it. She was curled tight, eyes closed, her breath slow. The wood still creaked faintly beneath her weight. For a moment, Eli couldn't move. That was Maren's chair. No one had sat in it since she passed. He took a step back, unsure of the feeling in his chest. Not pain, not quite. Something softer. Ash stirred, opened her eyes halfway, and gave the faintest chirp, like a question. Eli exhaled. "It's okay," he said, his voice a little rough. "You can have it." That night he left the porch light on, just in case she came back. And she did, every night after. Sometimes she stayed curled on the rocking chair, sometimes beneath it. Sometimes she wandered to the edge of the woods and sat as if standing guard. Once he saw her chase a cricket with a clumsy hop that ended in a tumble of grass and paws. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. The forest was healing, slowly, in patches. And so, it seemed, was he. The mornings began with soft thuds now, tiny paws landing on the porch steps just as the first blush of dawn stretched across the sky. Eli didn't need an alarm anymore. Ash came with the sun. She had learned the sounds of his routine, the kettle's rattle, the creak of floorboards, the screen door opening. Each morning, he'd find her waiting, sometimes curled under the rocking chair, sometimes stretched across the porch like she owned it. And in a way, she did. Eli placed a shallow bowl of water next to the old planter box and a dish with shredded chicken near the railing. He always spoke gently, even when she wasn't close. It wasn't so much for her. It was for the space between them, the quiet that had once swallowed his days whole. Filling it with soft words made things lighter. At first, she only ate when he stepped away, but over time, the space she needed shrank. A week later, she began eating while he sat just a few feet away, his boots dusted with ash, the steam from his coffee coiling into the air between them. Sometimes she paused mid-chew, her golden eyes watching him like a flickering flame. He never moved toward her. That was their ritual. Every trust was earned, never taken. He learned her rhythms. The way she would stretch her back legs first before the front. The chirp she made before lying down. How she'd clean her face meticulously with the back of her paw, then blink slowly at him, as if saying, "I see you." And maybe, in some strange way, she did. On one overcast afternoon, Eli left the cabin door open while he cleaned. A breeze carried the scent of pine needles through the house. He didn't expect her to enter, but he left the door open anyway. By dusk, she was at the threshold, just sitting, staring. He said nothing, just kept sweeping. Then, tiny footsteps on wood. He turned slightly. She had come inside, just a few feet, her tail low, cautious, eyes scanning every corner. The room was dim, lit only by the orange hues of the setting sun spilling across the floor. Ash walked slowly to the stone fireplace and sat just beneath the portrait of Maren that still hung above the mantel. She tilted her head, then lay down and closed her eyes. Eli's hand tightened around the broom handle. He didn't speak, he barely breathed. And after a few minutes, she stood, walked out, and disappeared into the tree line again. It became part of the ritual. In the mornings, she waited on the porch. In the evenings, she visited the cabin, stayed a little longer each time. Sometimes she slept by the hearth, sometimes by the open window, watching moths flicker against the glass. The house felt different with her inside. Not full, not yet, but less empty. Eli started noticing things he hadn't before. The way the light hit the old rocking chair just before dusk, how the wind carried the scent of smoke only after rain, how the silence wasn't so oppressive when it was shared. He called the local wildlife office eventually, asked about bobcat rehabilitation. "She's still wild," he said, "but she's young, alone, might need help." They said they could come, that they had the resources, but they asked if she could be caught. Eli looked at the chair where she'd curled just the night before. Her paw had rested over the edge, limp with trust. Her eyes had closed completely. "I don't know," he said quietly. He didn't call again. He built her a shelter instead, just off the porch. Cedar branches, an old wool blanket, the roof angled to let water run off. She used it sometimes, especially when the night turned colder. He left out food less frequently now, encouraged her to hunt, to follow instinct. Sometimes he'd find a trail of feathers or see her darting through the brush, leaner, faster, more sure of herself. But she always came back, every evening, even the nights when she had already eaten. That's when he knew. It wasn't about the food anymore, it was something else, companionship maybe, or maybe just presence. One particularly cold morning, Eli opened the door and found her already on the porch, curled tightly in the rocker, a thin dusting of frost over her whiskers. She blinked slowly, lifted her head, and let out a soft purr chirp, half greeting, half demand. All right, Eli murmured. "Breakfast it is." As he stepped outside, he noticed something new on the rocker. A small feather, delicate, pale grey, laid carefully on the wooden slats, as if placed there. A gift. He stared at it for a long time, his breath fogging in the cold. A memory surfaced. Maren, laughing in the garden, a feather tucked behind her ear. "Look," she had said. "A sign! Someone's watching over us!" Eli reached for the feather now. It was light in his palm, fragile. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt right. That night, when Ash returned, she didn't pause at the door. She walked straight in. and when she curled up beside the fireplace, Eli simply nodded. They had their rituals now, and trust, real trust, was no longer a question. It was a home. The first gust came without warning, a sudden rush of wind that bent the pine tops like wheat stalks, scattering needles across the porch and sending the wind chimes into a frantic clatter. Eli stood at the window, one hand pressed against the cool glass, watching the sky shift from steel grey to an unnatural green. The radio crackled again, this time urgent. Unexpected system rolling through the Flathead region, winds reaching 60 mph, lightning risk high due to dry timber. All stations prep for fire flare-ups, evacuations on standby. Eli's stomach sank. Not again. He stepped out onto the porch. The air had changed, thick, electric, buzzing in his ears. Ash wasn't there. She hadn't come for dinner. She never missed dinner. The trees groaned overhead as he scanned the tree line, calling gently, "Ash." No movement, just wind, dry leaves tumbling across the gravel like whispers with nowhere to go. He grabbed his jacket, the one with the reflective strip across the back, and slung his old ranger's pack over one shoulder. A flashlight, extra water, his worn first aid kit. He locked the cabin door behind him, even though he didn't know why. He headed for River Bend. It was where she always lingered, where the fire had burned hottest weeks ago. The smell of char still clung to the rocks there. Eli had often found her watching the river from a fallen log, as if remembering something she'd never lived. The storm broke overhead just as he reached the bend. Rain came in sideways sheets. Thunder cracked like gunshots across the valley. He called out again, louder now. "Ash, come on, girl!" Lightning flickered. Too close. The wind whipped through his jacket. He felt the sting of gravel against his shins as he pressed forward, heart thudding, then movement. A flash of tawny fur through the underbrush, disappearing toward the ridge. He ran, branches lashed at his arms. The forest floor, soaked and slippery, threatened to take his footing with every step. But he saw her again, just a glimpse, turning to look back before vanishing over the rise. She was leading him. That thought anchored him as he climbed, lungs burning, boots sliding in the thickening mud. At the top, he stopped. Below lay the eastern gully, a wide scar from the last fire, still littered with fallen timber and half-burnt brush. In the center, a lightning-struck tree split clean in two. Smoke curled from its trunk. Ash stood nearby, tail low, pacing in tight circles. He called to her. She didn't come. Instead, she turned sharply and limped toward a shadowed cluster of rocks at the gully's edge. Eli followed, slowly, cautiously, shining his light ahead. That's when he saw it, a hollow between the rocks, blackened. Hidden from view unless you knew where to look. And inside, something small, motionless, his breath caught, another bobcat, much smaller than Ash, younger, barely moving. He dropped to his knees beside the crevice, careful not to make a sound. The kitten was curled into a tight ball, fur singed, breathing shallow. One paw twitched as he reached forward, and a soft cry escaped its throat. Weak, broken. Ash stood behind him, her body rigid, eyes locked on the smaller form. It wasn't just another wildcat, it was her sibling or her cub. Eli didn't know, didn't need to. What he did know was that this kitten was dying. Without a word, he shrugged off his jacket, wrapped the tiny body carefully, and cradled it against his chest. The warmth of the bundle pressed into his ribs like a second heartbeat. He turned back to Ash. "We need to go." She didn't hesitate. Together they ran through the storm, Eli clutching the kitten tight, Ash darting alongside like a flicker of smoke. The path home felt longer, The forest, unfamiliar in the storm's wrath, twisted and bent under the wind's howl. By the time the cabin's porch light came into view, Eli's arms were numb, his legs shaking. Inside, he laid the tiny bobcat down on a towel near the fireplace and stoked the embers until flames rose again. Ash hovered nearby, low to the ground, eyes wide. Eli checked the kitten's breathing. Still there, barely. He worked quickly. Warm compresses, droplets of sugar water against its tongue. The same tricks he'd used decades ago during fawn rescues. Ash never left its side. By morning, the storm had passed, and the kitten's breathing had deepened, slow and steady. Ash was asleep beside it, their bodies curved into one another, matching heartbeats. Eli sat across from them in Marin's rocker, his coffee untouched. His hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from wonder. What had this wild thing done? She hadn't fled the fire. She had found her way through it, and she had brought him to the one thing that still tethered her to the world. Eli leaned back and closed his eyes, not to rest, but to remember. The sound of the rain had already faded, but the silence that followed, it wasn't empty anymore. It held breath, held presence, held promise. The dawn after the storm came soft, pale, and impossibly still. Light filtered through the mist, like breath held too long, hesitant to touch the edges of what had been nearly lost. The fire had spared the ranger's cabin, just barely. Char streaks along the eastern fence told the story, and the pine needles on the roof still smoldered faintly. Inside, near the fireplace, two forms stirred beneath a wool blanket. Ash had barely moved all night. She had stayed curled around the smaller kitten, her flank rising and falling like a lullaby. At one point, Eli had woken to find her licking the kitten's ears, slow and deliberate, a gesture full of something more than instinct. It was devotion. Now the little one blinked its eyes open, blue-grey, unfocused at first. Its body, still thin and frail, shifted slightly. And then, barely more than a flutter, a tiny paw reached out. It trembled as it extended, touching Ash's front leg, and then relaxed again. Eli watched from the kitchen doorway, one hand wrapped around his coffee mug. He hadn't slept more than an hour, but his fatigue felt sacred somehow. Earned. He approached quietly, setting a saucer of warmed formula near the fire. The kitten flinched, eyes alert now. Ash looked up too, ears twitching. "It's okay," Eli said softly. "No rush." He sat beside them, not too close, just close enough to share the warmth of the hearth. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was waiting. After a few minutes, the kitten sniffed the air. Then, with a tiny grunt of effort, it pulled itself toward the saucer. Its legs shook, its head dipped, and slowly, hesitantly, it began to drink. Ash didn't take her eyes off Eli. "You did good," he murmured. "Real good." Later that morning, after the little one had eaten and curled back into a sleep heavier than safety itself, Eli stepped onto the porch with his radio. The call to Montana Wildlife Services was calm, measured, but firm. "I've got 2 bobcat kittens here," he said. "One in recovery, the other, older, semi-independent, both fire-affected. They'll need transport to rehab, or at least evaluation." The voice on the other end hesitated. "How old are we talking?" "One's about 6 weeks," Eli said. "The other, maybe 10 or 11. Female, intelligent, calm, unusual behavior. She brought me to the younger one. I don't think they're litter mates, but there's a bond, strong one." "You sure she's not just dependent?" Eli looked through the window. Ash was curled back on the rug, her ears flicking as the smaller kitten sighed in its sleep. "No," he said. "She's something else. She's choosing to stay." The agent said they'd send a team in the morning. Safe containment. No sedation unless absolutely necessary. Standard procedure. Eli agreed. He gave his coordinates and thanked them, but his voice felt heavy. That afternoon, he did something he hadn't done since Maren passed. He brought out her old camera, the Canon she used on every hike, every ridge trail, every misty morning she wanted to remember. He dusted it off, checked the battery. Then he sat cross-legged near the fire and raised the lens. He took one photo. Ash, half asleep, the fire casting flickers across her fur, her paw protectively draped over the smaller kitten. A single frozen breath of time. A moment that felt sacred. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Eli opened the door and stepped outside, needing the dusk air to ground him. The wind had changed direction again, this time from the north. Cool, clean, sharp with pine. He thought about what came next. The team would come, they'd take the kittens to a center, maybe miles from here, maybe somewhere Ash wouldn't understand. Would they separate them? Would she be caged again after learning how to be free? He closed his eyes. It was the right thing. He knew that, but it didn't make it easier. He heard the door creak behind him, then pause on wood. Ash stepped onto the porch, silent as moonlight. She didn't look at him, just sat at the edge, watching the treetops sway in the fading gold of evening. After a while, Eli sat beside her. Not too close, just beside. "You knew she was out there," he said, voice low. "You knew and you brought me." Ash blinked slowly, the kind of blink cats give when they trust you. He didn't reach for her, didn't touch. Instead, he laid something beside her paw, the feather, the one she had placed on the rocker days ago. She looked down, touched it with her nose. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She leaned, not much, not enough to lose her edge, but enough that her shoulder brushed against his knee. Eli closed his eyes, let the warmth move through him. Tomorrow would come, the truck, the team, the questions. But tonight belonged to them, to the crackle of a fire inside, to a trembling paw reaching for comfort, to a porch that no longer felt empty, to trust, fierce and fragile, wrapped in fur and breath and stillness. And in that moment, as the last light slipped through the pines, Eli knew. Some bonds are born in fire, but the strongest ones are forged in the quiet that comes after. The truck arrived just after sunrise, a white government vehicle with the Montana Wildlife Service's logo printed on the side, tires crackling over the gravel path as it came to a slow, respectful stop in front of the cabin. The two agents who stepped out moved with practiced calm, one older with crow's feet that deepened when he nodded, the other younger, clipboard in hand, trying not to look too green. Eli was already waiting on the porch. Ash sat beside him, not tethered, not caged, just there, still. The smaller kitten, now stronger, peeked from the shelter by the fire as the agent stepped forward. One of them, Mara, according to her badge, crouched low, voice soft as she assessed. "Both look stable. The little one's doing better than expected." The other, James, nodded toward Ash. "And this one? You say she found the other?" Eli nodded. "Led me right to her, watched over her all night. She's not a pet, but she's more than wild." Mara glanced at Ash, who returned the look with those gold glass eyes, clear, aware, waiting. "She doesn't run? She stays," Eli said simply. They brought out the crates, one small, with warm lining, soft bedding, the other larger, built for adult cats. Safe, but firm. Standard procedure. The moment the small one mewed and was lifted into the smaller crate, Ash tensed. Her ears flattened slightly. She let out a low, soft growl. Not aggressive. Protective. Eli stepped in front of her. lowering himself until they were eye to eye. "It's okay, girl," he whispered. "They'll take care of her, like you did." Ash looked past him to the crate, where the kitten curled into the blanket, trembling from movement, not fear. She blinked slowly, then turned and walked, on her own, toward the larger crate. James opened the door. Ash stepped inside. No resistance, no panic, just choice. Eli's chest ached in ways he hadn't expected. He nodded once. "You'll keep them together?" "We'll try," Mara promised. "They'll go to Bitterroot Rehabilitation Center. High success rate, good land, big release zone." Eli looked at the crates. One tiny heartbeat, one wild guardian. His cabin had never felt so full, or so hollow. "Let me walk her out," he said. The agent stepped back. Eli picked up the crate with Ash, gently. It was heavy with something more than weight, something unnameable. He carried it to the porch steps, where the sun was just breaking through the mist, laying down stripes of gold across the earth. Ash looked out through the door's slats. She didn't cry, didn't scratch, just watched. "You did more than I could," Eli murmured. "More than most would." He set the crate down, paused, and pulled something from his pocket. Marin's feather. He slipped it through the bars of the crate. It landed lightly between Ash's paws. A soft exhale left her, as if memory had breath of its own. When the truck drove off, disappearing between the trees, Eli stood motionless for a long time, not crying, not quite, just feeling the space they'd left behind. The fire burned low inside, and in its place, stillness, but not the empty kind. Weeks passed, the forest healed in patches, shoots of green pierced black soil. Birds returned, hesitant at first, then in full song. Rain came often, gentler now, washing away ash, coaxing life from the scorched. Eli returned to his work. Trail inspections, mapping new growth, clearing debris. But every morning, he left a small bowl of water on the porch. Every evening, he rocked once or twice in Marin's chair, waiting but not expecting, until one morning in late October, the feather came back. It lay on the porch railing, caught in a knot of pine sap. No note, no footprint, just the feather, light grey, soft as breath. Eli stepped onto the porch, staring at it for a long time. Then he looked toward the trees. Nothing moved, and yet he felt it, that she had come back. If only for a moment, if only to leave him something that said, "I remember too." Winter settled in quietly. Snow fell on the cabin roof, blanketing the world in hush. In his dreams, Eli sometimes saw a flash of tawny fur between the trees, a pair of gold eyes watching from just beyond the firelight, a kitten's paw reaching out, not in fear, but recognition. And sometimes, in the early dawn, when the wind curled around the windows just so, he swore he could hear it. That soft, chirping sound, a question, a memory, a promise. Somewhere, far from the cabin, two bobcats roam, one young, fast, strong, still learning the language of wind and leaf and prey. The other, quiet, watchful, a step behind, a breath ahead. They hunt, they hide, they thrive. But sometimes, when the moon is high and the frost coats the pines, the older one stops, looks east, and remembers a man with hands like bark and voice like rain, a man who listened, a man who waited, a man who, without needing to tame her, gave her a name and let her go. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here on Pawprints and Stories, we believe some bonds never end, and some hearts are never truly wild, just gently held.